Hi class, this is the lecture video for the Evaluating Information week. Before we do that though, I did want to say a little bit about Unit 3 more generally. So the first two units were all um, not completely, but very heavily technically based, learning formal evaluations and presentations of arguments. Uh, this is this unit and the next one is more finesse based. It's taking these hard skills we learned, hard in the sense of concrete and definite, in units 1 and 2, and learning how to apply them broadly and generally, and to kind of make an art out of and a virtue out of is a better word, um, doing the kinds of critical thinking that it's discussing. And one of the reasons I use the word virtue goes back to Aristotle, is we're trying to turn these things into habit, something we do all the time, non-reflectively, without thinking about it, to just make ourselves better conveyors, understanders, transmuters of information. And so that's you can expect a lot more open-ended type of practice than you did in the first few units, both on the discussion boards and on the exams. As a result, though, there's a lot more to be said for doing and for practice than I could really do justice for in these very brief lectures. And so I'm just going to walk you over some of the general ideas and core concepts and maybe over a few difficult points, and then turn you loose for it. So we were looking at the Dowden chapter 4, and in this, um, we're just talking about information literacy. Now, it is a bit of a shame that we could only spend, a week and a half on information literacy. Some of the more forward-looking universities make every freshman take an entire course dedicated to information literacy. I love seeing that because it's so important, because humans are just generally bad at it. And so, of course, everything here is going to be a rush. But if we tie it back to the beginning of the semester, really even wanting to be critical about information, about wanting to and checking what is true rather than accepting what is given, or worse, accepting what we want to hear, is already quite a bit of the battle, as we're going to see. So, uh, with all of that background, what we're really going to do is kind of expand a little on what he says about looking at views and assessing strange claims. Those are the two major parts in the chapter. So, when we're talking about assessing views, there's two core principles, and these are things that you want to practice all the time, not just in this course, but in life. And these are the principles of charity and the principles of credulity. Sorry. Oh, it's been a long day. So the principles of charity and the principles of fidelity. So we've briefly talked a little bit about some of these before, but now it's time to get explicit. And they have to do with when you hear somebody say something, right? That's when either of these principles come into play. The principle of charity, roughly speaking, says to make, when you're interpreting their view, when you're interpreting what is said, make it as reasonable as is consistent with what they say. So I know that's an overly precise way to say things, but you can't say make it look as good as possible, because, as Dowden rightly points out, sometimes people do say things that are wrong or false, etc., and we can't interpret that away and shouldn't. But if there is a reasonable, sane, non-crazy way to interpret their words, then that's what we should do. And by we, I mean the collective we. I mean, this is something every human being should do. Um, and to do anything else is to be, first of all, unnecessarily combative, but also you stand a very good risk of undermining your ability to have any kind of dialogue if you are not interpreting them charitably. When did we talk about this before is a good way to situate ourselves. Uh, when we were talking about fallacies last unit, we talked about straw man and steel man. Remember, a straw man is to distort a view to make it look worse. The opposite of a straw man is a steel man, is to present the view in the strongest light possible. And that's really all the principle of charity says, is to present a view in the strongest way you can. But notice we have to say a view, because if we start changing the view, then we've violated the second principle, which is the principle of fidelity. Fidelity means faithfulness. And so the principle of fidelity tells us we still have to capture what they're saying. We have to preserve their intended meaning. And so there's very obvious ways to violate either principle. The harder part is to make sure we always uphold it. So Dowden's pretty good at going through a lot of examples, and during the weekly discussions I assign specific examples. But if you just think about how political discourse is, well, people say things incautiously all the time. It's really hard to be a politician because everything you say is subject to scrutiny. And so you see something I saw in the news recently. It's certainly not a view I am saying we should agree or disagree with, but we should accurately transmit. There was somebody who spoke who said something about the exact wording was unfortunate, but it had to do with getting rid of trans issues. And several left-wing media jumped on it to take it to be interpreted as genociding trans people, which was clearly a violation of the principle of charity. One can talk about getting rid of transitioning without getting rid of the people who are transitioning. Those are two very, very different things. And one is much, 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 much more extreme and indefensible than the other. And so the principle of charity tells us if there's a more defensible and less defensible interpretation of what is said, it is charitable to defer to the more reasonable or the less unreasonable, for that matter. And one thing Dowden points out that we always forget, and you can ask for clarification. Don't ever forget that. If you're not sure if they mean the crazy view or not, just ask them. That's why any news source you read to, they should be reaching out to that representative's office for comment, and they do. And the representative's office clarified and said, well, no, I did not mean the genocide. I meant getting rid of the transition. And so it was just a gross violation of principle of charity. And notice, again, much like a lot of the stuff we talked about earlier, we're not talking about whether we agree with the person or not. We're talking about if we are going to disagree with the person, disagree with their real view, disagree with their strongest view, disagree with their most well-supported view, just to avoid doing a straw man. But again, sometimes people do say